Welcome back. We're going to move into the digestive system now. By far, this one has the best comics of all of the different systems. So, this one basically is kind of giving you a rundown of exactly what we're going to be going over as we go through the system. So, your digestive system is going to consist of this very long tube that runs all the way through your body. It is a complete tube. The tube is called the alimentary canal. It consists of the oral cavity, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small bowel, and then the large intestine, rectum, and then the anus. So this is a complete tube. If you picture your body, picture it like a donut. So you've got, the outside, and then you've got the donut part, and then there's this hole in the middle. That hole in the middle is your digestive tract. So there is an entire complete tube running through you. Take that donut and set it on a table, and now take a couple M&Ms and put them in the donut hole. Are they in the donut? Not really. They're sitting on the table in the hole of the donut. Anything that's in your digestive tract is not in your body. It's just like those M&Ms sitting on that table. So you want to think of this as, this is a tube that is essentially continuous with the external environment. So technically, anything that is inside of that tube is external to your body. In addition to the tube, we have the accessory organs. We've got salivary glands, the liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. They're not part of the tube, but they secrete into the tube. We have 6 different things that are going to happen in the tube. We start with a process called ingestion. This is pretty straightforward. You bring food in, okay? This is specific to the mouth. And then we begin a process of mechanical breakdown. This is going to physically break the food into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, creating surface area for your enzymes to work on later. So we start mechanical breakdown in the mouth by chewing. We also start chemical breakdown in the mouth because we have salivary amylase that begins to chemically break down starch into glucose in your mouth as well. So we've got mechanical breakdown and chemical breakdown in the mouth. Then we swallow into the pharynx and esophagus, and we start into the next piece, which is propulsion. So swallowing allows us to move through here. And that's going to take us then into peristalsis as we move down the esophagus, which is a rhythmic contraction of the smooth muscles that's really going to help move things basically all the way through the tube once you get past the swallowing aspect. There we've got more skeletal muscles involved. After that, the smooth muscles really take over. So we're going to move food down into the stomach. Here we're going to continue mechanical breakdown with churning. Your stomach kind of functions like a cement mixer where everything is constantly being brought up from the bottom and pushed to the top. So there's a churning motion that's happening. We are also going to continue the chemical digestion, particularly of proteins and lipids in the stomach. We don't really do a lot of the next, which is absorption, but we can absorb water, alcohol, lipid-soluble drugs, and some vitamins across the stomach, but not too much. We then go into the small intestine. This is your primary digestive organ. We continue mechanical breakdown with segmentation. We finish all of our chemical breakdown, and we do basically all of our absorption of nutrients and the majority of absorption of water across the wall of the small intestine into either the blood or the lymphatic system. After that, the residue is going to move into the large intestine. We'll continue the reabsorption process, mainly of water. That is going to have the effect of compacting the fecal matter down to something that is somewhat solid so that we can go through the last process, which is defecation. So we've got ingestion, mechanical breakdown, propulsion, chemical digestion, absorption, and defecation that occur in the tube. When we look at the different type of movements that can occur, peristalsis is a constant rhythmic contraction that moves things down the tube. And it's kind of this squeeze and pull action that you're going to see. Segmentation that occurs in the small intestine is going to be a little bit of a forward, back, forward, back, forward, back. So you've got multiple contractions happening at the same time, and it's going to have the effect of moving and mixing up the food and allowing us to really push this food up against the wall of the small intestine to do something called contact digestion. We're going to come back to that concept a little bit later. So now let's look at how we control this. So we need to control the environment of the lumen, or the hole of our donut, and that is outside the body. So this is a very strange situation where we are actually trying to control an external environment. We have to control it though, because if we don't, we're not going to be able to effectively break down and then absorb our nutrients. The stimulus to create this environment actually lies within the wall of the tube. We have tons of receptors in there. We've got stretch receptors, receptors that look at osmolarity and pH. We have receptors for both the substrates and end products of given pathways. So think about this for a second. If we have a whole lot of substrate, then it means we need to release enzymes so we can break it down into the end products. But if we have a whole lot of end products, we probably don't need a whole lot of enzymes because it means that we've taken care of what's there. So this is a really, really finely tuned system. These sensors are all going to initiate reflexes that will either turn on or turn off gland secretion and either cause muscle contraction or allow it to relax. The controls, we have intrinsic and extrinsic, also known as short and long. So the intrinsic is basically within the tube itself. Long is going to exist outside. So when you've got something other than the gut that is controlling the gut. So this is kind of the short reflexes or the intrinsic, where everything's happening within the gut. The long reflexes involve your brain. Like, oh, hey, I was just driving down the road and I smelled these French fries, and so I decided I needed to have French fries. And when you smell them, you begin to secrete into the tube. That's a long reflex. There's nothing in the tube that requires that secretion. This is entirely your brain going, I want French fries. And so your gut begins to prepare for French fries. So that's a long reflex versus a short one. So when we look at the membrane system here, we are going to see something a little bit different than what we've seen before. The cavity, the abdominal pelvic cavity, is not subdivided like the thoracic cavity that we've been working in thus far. So all of these organs, which are essentially a big tube that winds itself back and forth, are going to be covered in serous membranes called the peritoneum. As always, the visceral layer is attached to the surface of the organs, but the parietal layer is actually attached to the body wall. So here we have a true cavity, the peritoneal cavity filled with fluid. So what we've seen up to this point is that we usually say, well, the pericardial cavity isn't really a cavity. The pleural cavity isn't really a cavity. They're more potential spaces where the membranes lie right on top of each other. The best way to visualize all of the membrane systems in here, I think, is this view. So let's start with the visceral and parietal peritoneum, because this is something that we're familiar with, this concept of a serous membrane. The visceral is this light blue surrounding the entire length of the tube. Here it is on the small bowel, the transverse colon, the stomach, the liver. So all of the organs have the visceral peritoneum. The parietal peritoneum is attached to the body wall. So, here they're very close, but here they're really far away. This is the peritoneal cavity. So we've got parietal coming up through here, over here, okay. Then we have a whole bunch of other membrane systems that are going to help organize this very, very long tube. This tube is meters long. Your small intestine alone is almost 6 meters long. And it's winding its way through this cavity, and we have to make sure that it doesn't begin to sort of twist back on itself or anything like that, because that can absolutely lead to obstructions and necrosis and serious problems. So we have to kind of organize it. So we've got a whole bunch of other pieces that come in here. The lesser omentum is this piece right here. This runs from the lesser curvature of the stomach to the liver. It is basically attaching the stomach to this really heavy liver so that the stomach can do all that churning but not flip backwards on itself. The transverse mesocolon right here, and then you can also see it right here, is attaching the transverse colon, this part right here, to the posterior body wall all along the length of the transverse colon. So basically the colon is suspended from the posterior body wall by this piece of connective tissue. The mesentery, which you can see here, is this extensive network of tissue that runs along the entire length of the small intestine. So it's running all along. Picture this very long tube. All along one side of it is a connection point to the mesentery that all then feed into this one point of connection. So again, the small bowel is essentially hanging from the posterior body wall by the mesenteries. Then we have the greater omentum, which is shown right here. It's this loop of tissue. It runs from the greater curvature of the stomach, comes down, flips up, and then attaches to the transverse colon. It's being retracted here, so it's being flipped up, but it's basically an apron of fat. You have no bones right here to protect these organs, and so this apron of fat is here to try to help protect this a little bit. So we have an extensive membrane system here. Now, basically once we go from the oral cavity into the pharynx and we start into the esophagus, the tube is going to have exactly the same 4 layers all the way through. We're going to see some modifications to the layers as we go, but it's still going to be these same 4 layers, starting with the innermost layer, which is called the mucosa. We're going to secrete mucus from this, digestive enzymes, and hormones. This is what we absorb our nutrients across, and it is going to be protective. The innermost layer in contact with the lumen is the epithelium. You should know that. We know that epithelium lines everything. So depending on where we're at, it will be stratified squamous or simple columnar. Superficial to that is a layer of loose connective tissue called the lamina propria that has a blood supply and our immune system, MALT. Then we have a thin layer of smooth muscle called the muscularis mucosae that determines essentially the size of the lumen. Usually it's contracted and it makes it very wrinkled, and so we're not taking up too much space. But when it relaxes, it's going to open the lumen up. All 3 of these layers make up the mucosa. The submucosa is a much thicker layer of loose connective tissue that has a massive blood, nerve, and lymphatic supply. Then, continuing superficial to that, we've got the muscularis externa, big thick layer of smooth muscle. Always going to see at least a longitudinal and a circular layer there. Sometimes we'll see modifications in this layer. This is what thickens up to form the different sphincters that are going to dictate how things move through here. And then finally we have the serosa, which is basically your visceral peritoneum. On the esophagus, because it's in the thoracic cavity, not the abdominal pelvic, it's the adventitia. It's a little bit thicker and it helps sort of blend into the neighboring tissues, holding the esophagus where it needs to be. So let's take a look at this. So, innermost layer, okay, is going to consist of the epithelium, the lamina propria,
and the muscularis mucosae. So right now it's very wrinkled, which means that the muscularis mucosae is contracted. If this layer relaxes, it's going to get much bigger. The lumen is going to get bigger because we're going to kind of relax all of this wrinkling that's occurring. So these three layers here, 1, 2, 3, they are going to make up your mucosal layer. Then we go into this much thicker layer here of loose areolar connective tissue. This is the submucosa. We're going to see a huge amount of blood vessels and glands and nerves and lymphatics that are all going to be running sort of through here. Then we have the two layers that make up the muscularis externa. We have the inner layer, which is circular, and the outer layer, which is longitudinal. So in the inner layer, the cells are running in a circle, and the longitudinal, they're running in the lengthwise view here. Finally, out here, we've got the serosa, which is your visceral peritoneum. There's two nerve plexuses that are also in here. There's a submucosal that basically lies right between the muscularis mucosae and the submucosa. And then there is the myenteric, which lies between the two layers of muscle. These are the major controllers of what's going to happen in this tube. So most of our intrinsic or our short reflexes rely on these. And occasionally you can see a ganglion sort of coming through here as well. So remember, that's a collection of cell bodies outside of the central nervous system. So those two plexuses make up what's called the enteric nervous system. It is basically the brain of your gut. There's more neurons in those than you have in your spinal cord. So that tells you there's a pretty significant role for this. So the role of these plexuses is to control the motility of the tube and the secretions. So determining basically, are we secreting, are we contracting, are we shutting off secretions, are we relaxing, what's going on with the tube.